your keynote address, of course, and for addressing those various topical issues of Next in Defense. All right, we are now quickly shifting our focus back to the other buzzword of the year, that has, of course, been trade. Trade is something that we've seen being talked about all across the world. Trade agreements have also been signed. And on the, again, very, very topical, pertinent, and interesting keynote address on trade, taxation, tariffs, and the fight against smuggling as part of our NXT in trade segment, we're very, very privileged to now be joined by member of the National Assembly of South Africa, Mr. Alan Beesley. Mr. Beesley, could we please have you on stage for your keynote address? Let's keep the applause going. We need the energy in the room to continue to grow now as the evening continues. Thank you.
Trade, taxation, tariff, and the fight against smuggling and the illicit trade. Ladies and gentlemen, illicit trade is no longer a peripheral issue in the global economy. It is a structural challenge affecting government revenues, legitimate businesses, and the integrity of global supply chains. According to the Transnational Alliance to Combat Illicit Trade in its 2025 Global Illicit Trade Environment Index, illicit trade now spans almost every major sector of the international economy, from tobacco and alcohol to pharmaceuticals, fuel, gold, and consumer goods. The report estimates that illicit markets are worth well over $2 trillion globally, representing a substantial share of the world trade. This phenomenon undermines public finances, distorts markets, and empowers organized criminal networks. But it also raises a deeper policy question. How do governments design trade, tax, and enforcement systems that protect legitimate commerce whilst discouraging illicit activity? My remarks today draw on experience of South Africa, but the lessons are relevant to many countries confronting similar dynamics. South Africa today illustrates a striking divergence between two economies. The legal economy has struggled to grow, expanding at less than 1% annually in recent years. At the same time, the illicit economy has expanded rapidly, growing at an estimated 6% per year and flooding the market with illegal cigarettes, alcohol, gold, fuel, and counterfeit goods. This divergence is not accidental. It reflects the interaction between tax policy, trade policy, and enforcement capacity. Consider the example of tobacco taxation. In South Africa, excise duties on cigarettes and related products have increased steadily in recent years, almost always above the rate of inflation. The policy rationale is understandable. Higher taxes are intended to reduce consumption for public health reasons. However, the outcome has been quite different from what policymakers intended. A legal compliant pack of cigarettes in South Africa now sells for roughly 35 Rand, about $2 or more. Illicit cigarettes, by contrast, can be purchased for 10 Rand or roughly half a dollar, often in the same retail environment. They are 80% cheaper than legal products. When such a large price differential exists, the market adjusts rapidly. Consumers shift towards cheaper illicit products, while criminal networks step in to meet demand. The result is a rapid expansion of the illicit market. In fact, illicit cigarettes are now estimated to account for about 75% of total cigarette sales in South Africa. The fiscal consequences are significant. The South African government loses an estimated 100 billion, roughly $6 billion, to illicit trade across the broader economy, including alcohol, tobacco, fuel, and counterfeit goods. Even within the tobacco sector alone, excise revenues has fallen despite repeated tax increases, demonstrating the limits of relying on taxation without enforcement. But the costs extend beyond government revenue. Illicit trade undermines legitimate business and destroys jobs. A recent example illustrates this clearly. A major international tobacco manufacturer with decades-long presence in South Africa recently announced that it would cease domestic cigarette manufacturing, citing the overwhelming dominance of illicit cigarettes in the market. The decision threatens hundreds of direct jobs and tens of thousands more across agriculture, logistics, and related supply chains. This example highlights a key principle in the fight against smuggling. Policy coherence matters. If tax regimes create price gaps that legitimate businesses cannot realistically compete with, and if enforcement systems are not sufficiently resourced to police borders and supply chains, illicit markets will inevitably expand. Yet, it is important to emphasize that combating illicit trade does not require impossible, complex solutions. In many respects, the fundamentals are straightforward. First, tax regimes must be calibrated carefully. Excise duties, particularly on products like tobacco and alcohol, should not increase so rapidly that they create extreme price disparities between legal and illicit products. Moderating the price of increases can narrow the incentive for smuggling while persevering the viability of legitimate industries. Secondly, enforcement capacities must match policy ambition. Taxes only function effectively if governments have the institutional capacity to enforce compliance. In South Africa, this means strengthening agencies such as the South African Revenue Services, the South African Police Services, the National Prosecuting Agency, and the Border Management Authority. These institutions are responsible for policing borders, investigating criminal networks, and ensuring that tax laws are enforced through the supply chain. Third, trade infrastructure must be modernized. One of the most effective tools in combating smuggling is the deployment of modern cargo scanners at ports and border posts. Advanced container scanners, risk-based cargo inspections, and integrated customs intelligence systems dramatically improve government's ability to detect illicit shipments before they enter the domestic markets. In many developing economies, including South Africa, insufficient capacity at major ports remains a critical vulnerability that organized criminal networks exploit. Fourthly, international cooperation is essential. Illicit trade is inherently transnational. Smuggled goods often cross multiple jurisdictions before reaching consumers. Intelligence sharing, customs cooperation, and coordinated enforcement operations between countries are therefore essential components of any effective response. None of these measures alone is sufficient, but together they can form a coherent strategy. The central lesson is that the fight against illicit trade is fundamentally about balance. Tax policy must pursue legitimate policy objectives, whether fiscal revenue or public health, without unintentionally empowering criminal markets. Trade systems must facilitate commerce while maintaining robust safeguards against abuse. Enforcement agencies must be adequately resourced and technologically equipped to keep pace with increasingly sophisticated smuggling networks. When these elements align, legitimate businesses can compete fairly, governments can collect the revenues that they are due, and consumers can be protected from unregulated and potentially dangerous products. But when they fall out of alignment, when taxes rise faster than enforcement capacity, or when borders remain porous, while price incentives grow, illicit market and smuggling expands rapidly. The stakes are significant. Illicit trade does not merely deprive government of revenue, it corrodes state institutions, undermines the rule of law, and displaces legitimate economic activity. For countries like South Africa, desperately seeking growth, investment, and job creation, allowing the illicit economy to expand unchecked is simply not sustainable. The good news, however, is that progress is possible. By combining balanced taxation, effective enforcement, modern trade infrastructure, and international cooperation, governments can significantly reduce the incentives and opportunity for smuggling. The challenge before us is therefore not to simply recognize the scale of illicit trade and smuggling, but to ensure that our policy frameworks are aligned to confront it effectively. I thank you.